Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Ian Scott, and I am the managing partner at Scott Legal. And an interesting thing about me, because given the topic we are going to go through today, is that I have been on a TN visa I was on a TN visa for 10 years and renewed it multiple times. I'm Canadian and renewed it a number of times across the border. Renewed it both at ports of entry, and once I renewed at land port of entry. So kind of know what you're going through if you are considering the TN category. And so, yeah, so we're going to talk about the TN visa. In particular, we're going to talk about the concept of sponsorship. I think this comes up a lot when you are going through the TN visa process. You want to go to the United States, and then the first thing that the employer might ask you is, does this is this a sponsorship, the visa that you need? And that we're going to explain that. A few housekeeping items before we get into the webinar. This webinar is being recorded, so we will send you a version of the webinar after it is done. And a few other things that we will send you. We will send you a TN visa guide. We will also send you some information on how you could set up a consultation if you would like to. And of course, we will also send you a link to our YouTube channel. And that's actually where the webinar will be posted, and you could watch it again at your leisure and to post any questions there that you have as well. So with respect to questions and answers during the actual webinar, you can either add them to the Q&A box or the chat box. We will get to all questions during the webinar, either during or at the end of the webinar. So please feel free to add questions. We are lucky today to have Dustin Saldarriaga, who has processed a number of TN visas for both Canadian nationals and Mexican nationals at multiple different posts. And he is going to walk us through the TN visa requirements. So I'll turn it over to Dustin.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you all for joining us for today's presentation on the TN visa. Let's first go over what are the requirements for a TN visa. And the first and most fundamental requirement is that you do need to have a passport from either Canada or Mexico. The TN visa is rooted in NAFTA, so it is an agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So you don't need to necessarily have been born in one of those countries, but you do need a passport from Canada or Mexico. You need to be coming to the United States to be working in one of a number of listed professions. So during today's presentation, I'm going to be frequently referring to the TN, what I'll call the TN regulations. So if you are at a computer, I do recommend that you quickly open up Google and just search for NAFTA, N-A-F-T-A, TN regulations. And when you do that, you will see a list of a number of professions. So I'm pulling it up myself. You scroll down the list and you see first on the list is accountant, and then architect, then computer systems analyst. If you keep going down, you'll see veterinarians, you'll see nutritionists, occupational therapists. There are literally dozens of professions. That's the pro. The con is that if you're coming to the US to do something outside of those professions, the TN visa is not going to be the best fit for you. So you do need to be coming to the US to work in one of those listed professions. Now, you do actually need a job offer. So there needs to be an employer in the United States that wants to employ you in one of those listed professions. And you do actually need to bring proof of that job offer with you to apply for the TN. And we'll talk more about what's included in that application. You need to be qualified for your specific profession. So again, referring to the TN regulations, you'll see that for each of those listed professions, there's a specific way that you qualify for the profession. So when I say you need to qualify for the profession, I'm not saying how do you qualify for the job based on what the employer wants to see. The employer might want to see someone with 20 years of experience. That's not what the government cares about. What the government cares about is what's in the regulations. So if you look at, let's take accountant. To qualify as an accountant, you need either a baccalaureate degree or a licenciatura degree. or a license to practice as an accountant, a CPA, a CA, a CGA, or a CMA. If you go to, let's take another example. You look at management consultants. To qualify, you need either a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree, or professional experience of 5 years. Okay, so there you see management consultant is different from an accountant. So make sure once you've defined what profession you're coming to the US to practice, that you qualify based on how the regulations define that qualification. And finally, in the job that you're coming to the US to do, you actually need to be doing the job duties that the government thinks that someone in that profession does. So how do you know what the government thinks an accountant does? Or how do you know what the government thinks a management consultant does? The way you would figure that out is using the second of what are really, along with the TN regulations, what is really a key resource in a TN application, which is the Occupational Outlook Handbook, or OOH. So again, if you're at your computer, Google OOH, and then let's just take accountants as an example. So Google OOH accountant, and you'll see at the top of that page, if you click what they do, you'll see that the government actually has a section titled Duties with a number of things that the government thinks an accountant does. So examine financial statements, compute taxes owed, inspect account books, organize financial records, etc. So these are the job duties that the government is going to want to see that you will be doing in the job in the United States. You don't have to verbatim say say I'm going to exactly do word for word what the Occupational Outlook Handbook says an accountant does, but your job duties should be aligned with what the government thinks the job does. So this might seem to some of you like, and of course, why would I come to the US to work as an accountant if I'm not going to be working as an accountant? But this does actually come up a lot. So it is always helpful to talk with your employer in the US, your prospective employer, see what they want you to do, and then look at the Occupational Outlook Handbook and just make sure that those job duties are similar to what the Occupational Outlook Handbook says that someone in that job will do. So the title of this presentation is, Does the TN visa require sponsorship? And that is one of the key questions that we receive. It's one of the most common questions we get from both prospective employees as well as prospective employers. And the short answer that we would give is that no, the TN visa does not require sponsorship. But it's worth giving you the longer answer as well, because you really do have to think about what is sponsorship. So usually when people ask about sponsorship, what they have in mind is something like an H-1B visa or a green card. And those options have far firmer, stronger requirements on the employer. So, for example, they might require that the employer pay a prevailing wage, which is a wage above the minimum wage. They might require that the employer test the labor market to see if anyone else in the United States, a US citizen or permanent resident, is available to do the job before they hire the immigrant worker. They might require that the employer not bench the worker, which means that they need to be actively employed the whole time that they're in the US. So these are significant requirements on an employer. The TN visa does not require any of those requirements. Basically, the TN employer, by and large, is able to treat the TN employee as any other employee. So they are at will, which means that they can be fired. Similarly, the TN employee can quit whenever they want. The employer only needs to pay a wage that complies with local and federal requirements, so minimum wage. So just like any other employee, they don't have to pay a wage above that, like a prevailing wage. They don't need to test the labor market. They don't need to make sure there's another US worker, there's not another US worker who wants the job. So as long as there's a Canadian or a Mexican national who is coming to them saying, hey, I want to work for you, if the employer decides, yeah, we have a job for you, that's really all that's needed insofar as any requirement to test the market. There is no requirement to test the market. So the requirements on the employer are really minimal. What does the employer actually need to do? They need to make an offer, a legitimate offer to the employee. So there needs to be a real job waiting for the worker in the US once the TN visa is approved. And the employer needs to sign a letter that says that and that explains, here's the job that awaits this individual. Here's what their job title will be. Here's what their pay will be. Here's what their job duties will be. And here's how long we plan to employ them. That letter does need to be signed with an original signature. We'll talk about that. But that letter is not a binding contract that the government is going to make sure is complied with. The government is not going to go after the employer if it turns out that the employer gives them a higher salary or a different salary. If the employer decides to fire the worker after a week because they were a terrible employee, that is okay. Again, the employee is an at-will employee, just like any other worker is. So when the employer would give, say, a US citizen employee a job offer that says, we want to pay you this much, we're going to employ you 40 hours a week, and here's what we expect in return. If that employee gets fired on day 2, it's not like the employee can then say, right, well, but you said you'd employ me 40 hours a week and you're firing me before I've worked that. Similarly here, right? You're an at-will employee. And similarly, like I said before, you have the right to leave. So you do have rights there as well. So hopefully, that puts most employers' minds at ease that the TN actually does not require sponsorship. Now, if the application is being submitted at USCIS, which means that the worker is within the United States. So they're applying for a change of status or an extension of TN status. Then the employer would technically file the forms with USCIS for that application. But that, again, does not create any significant additional responsibilities. It's mostly a formality where the employer is signing the forms and submitting them. The employee is still at will, even if that happens. If the employee is applying at a port of entry or say at an airport, then the employee is the one who's applying. So the employer, like I said before, would only need to sign that letter, that employer letter. And we'll talk more about what that letter needs to contain. So let's move on. I've only hinted at this so far, but there are very different options for nationals of Canada when comparing nationals of Mexico who want to apply for a TN visa. Nationals of Canada really have a lot of flexibility when applying for a TN. The TN, I should have said this before, but when someone comes to us and they're a national of Canada or Mexico, and they say, I want to work in the United States, the TN is probably going to be the first option we consider because it really is the most streamlined, the quickest option for a national of Canada or Mexico. But for Canadians, it's especially convenient. And there's a reason Ian was on one for 10 years. Canadians, and the reason it's so convenient for Canadians is that Canadians can apply at a port of entry. Nationals of Mexico have to apply at a consulate for a TN visa. So let's walk through what that looks like for a Canadian. So basically, they would get a job offer from an employer in the US. That employer would draft a letter, sign a letter, explaining exactly what I said before, the terms of the employment. And the National of Canada would bring that letter along with proof of how they qualify. So maybe that's their diploma, maybe that's their experience letters if they're applying based on experience, of course, their passport. And they would either leave the US or if they're already outside the US, then try to enter the US through either an airport or a border crossing. And they would present their application to the US Customs and Border Protection Officer and say, I'm applying for a TN, here's my application. If they're approved, they would be immediately admitted into the US in TN status and typically would be able to start working immediately. So that is a very inexpensive option. I think the total cost right now is about $56. It's also an instant decision, so it's a great option for nationals of Canada. Now, if you see so second bullet point, visas can be issued for 3 years. So U.S. CBP, Customs and Border Protection, can admit someone for up to 3 years in TN status. So when they admit the national of Canada, they will typically give them 3 years of status, TN status. Now, that benefit that I just described, applying at a port of entry, applies to nationals of Canada. You do need to be entering on your Canadian passport. So what if a national of Canada has a spouse who is not a national of Canada? That spouse would have to apply for a TN dependent visa at the consulate. The TD visa is what a dependent spouse or a child would receive. A spouse can study on a TD visa, cannot work, and a child can study on a TD visa, cannot work. But if they don't have a Canadian passport, they would need to apply for that at a consulate. So that is one of the very rare occasions where you might see a national of Canada apply for the visa at a consulate, which is where they have a dependent who is not a national of Canada. Nationals of Mexico must always follow that consular option in order to get a TN visa. Nationals of Mexico cannot be processed at a border for a TN visa. When a national of Mexico applies, I think this slide actually needs to be updated. They can actually be given a TN visa for up to 4 years. They would have to pay an additional amount for that option. And typically they would want to. I mean, it's just so convenient to be able to get 4 years. When they enter the US, even if they're given a 4-year visa, their period of stay, their status would be limited to a maximum of 3 years. But as long as their visa is valid, then they could leave and come back in for an additional 3-year period of status. If a national of Mexico is applying to renew their TN visa, then they could qualify for a mail-in option. And the consulate, what would happen is they would submit their application to the consulate, and the consulate would let them know you qualify for an interview waiver. They wouldn't request that proactively or beforehand. The consulate will let you know if you qualify. So that's an overview of the differences between Canadian and Mexican applicants. Canadians can apply at a port of entry, nationals of Mexico cannot. Both Canadians and nationals of Mexico, if they're within the US, can apply for TN status through USCIS. That is called a change of status if they are not currently in TN status. So let's say they're a student and they get a job offer after they've graduated. Someone wants to hire them. They could apply to change their status to TN status. Or if they're already here in TN status, let's say they're working for one employer, they get an offer from another employer, they could apply to extend their TN status to work for the new employer. But they would do that by submitting the application through USCIS, and either nationals of Mexico or Canada can do that. Let's talk briefly, quickly looking at the questions. Is there a minimum salary required? The answer is, legally speaking, based on regulation, no, there is not a minimum salary required by immigration law. However, you do need to comply with labor and employment laws. So you need to at least be paying minimum wage, and minimum wage is defined by federal law in addition to the state, and there may be a local minimum wage as well. So, but again, if the employer is based in a certain city, they're going to know what the minimum wage is there because they'll be paying that to any of their employees. The other thing to keep in mind regarding compensation is, strategically, it is wise to pay the employee what is common for someone in that job. So as an example, if you're applying to come to the US as a lawyer, let's say, and the US employer is going to be paying you minimum wage, that is going to look really strange. So Customs and Border Protection is going to wonder, why are you not being paid what a typical lawyer is paid? Are you going to be doing something different from what a lawyer does? Are you in fact going to be employed as a lawyer? Similarly, if the wage is unusually high, so let's say you're coming to the US as an accountant and you're going to be paid $400,000 a year. CBP may ask, are you actually going to be working as an executive? Are you actually going to be managing the company rather than working as an accountant and doing the job duties that the OOH defines? So that's where salary is relevant in that context. I am going to save the remaining questions for the end of the presentation, but we certainly should have time to get through all of them. Let's for now talk about some particularly difficult TN categories. So as you remember before, when you pull up the TN regulations, you see dozens of professions listed. I specifically talked about accountant. I mentioned management consultant. But there are dozens, and they're not all as easy to get approved for as others. So two categories that are particularly challenging are management consultant and economist. So let's talk about each of those and why they are difficult. They're difficult for different reasons. Management consultant applications. And I first want to clarify that it is not all management consultant applications that are challenging. If you're applying to come to the US as a management consultant to work for a management consulting firm like McKinsey, Bain, BCG, Oliver Wyman, any of these, then that is a straightforward application because it's clear who is going to be employing you, who is going to benefit from your work. That is not a particularly challenging or risky application. What is particularly risky is applying to work as a management consultant for a company that is not a management consulting firm. So why is that challenging? The reason is management consultant, if you remember before, the qualification is either a degree or experience. And the experience can be, I'm going to actually pull up the language that's in the regulations. You can use professional experience as established by a statement or professional credential attesting to 5 years of experience as a management consultant or 5 years of experience in a field of specialty that's related to the consulting agreement. So this means that you can apply as a management consultant without a college degree, without any educational degree. It is one of the very few TN professional categories that gives you the opportunity to apply if you don't have a degree or a diploma. So the government is aware that management consultant is a catch-all category. For anyone who doesn't have a degree, they're going to fall by and large only into this category. So the government does see many applicants who try to structure their application to fall into this category, even if they're not necessarily a good fit for it. At the same time, though, management consultant category, this category can be great for those people who are coming to the US to advise a company that is not a management consulting firm on improving its operations and where the applicant is in fact coming to work as a management consultant. So even though it's risky, it is a very unique and an important category to be aware of. So don't necessarily write it off just because it's risky. But I would say it is one of the categories that benefits from an attorney helping. So I like to talk about the management consulting category through an example. Let's say that there's a US employer that designs and manufactures solar panels. And so obviously not a consulting firm. And you are a national of Mexico and you have extensive experience researching and designing solar panels and helping companies improve their solar panel sales. So this US company that makes solar panels wants to hire you to help them improve their manufacturing process and improve their sales of solar panels. That would be a good fit for the management consulting category, but would be a risky application, meaning that the government is going to scrutinize it. So what do you need to do to improve the odds of getting approved given the scenario, the example I just provided? The first thing the government is going to want to see is that you're actually coming to the US to work as a management consultant. So again, you would Google OOH, management consultant. I think the government calls them management analysts. Make sure that you're doing the things for that solar panel company that the OOH says a management consultant does. That's the first thing. The second thing is you want to make it clear to the government that you are in fact coming to the US to work as a management consultant. And what do I mean when I say that? What a management consultant does is they show up, they study a challenge, they study a problem, and they offer solutions to that specific problem. They are not coming to fill a permanent role at the company, right? McKinsey will be hired to address a specific challenge. And then once they give the PowerPoint presentation to management, they're out the door, right? And that's kind of how you want to frame your job as a TN management consultant. Again, if you're coming to work for a company that's not a management consulting firm. So the solar panel company will want to show that, for example, they have a consulting agreement with you, that it's limited in time. It's not necessarily the full 3-year period they could ask for. It's a year or it's 2 years. It's also very specifically defined and targeted to the challenge they're facing. Our challenge is that we have been unable to break into a specific market, or our manufacturing process is too expensive. So this individual from Mexico is going to come and specifically help us address those problems. And here are the deliverables. In month 1, we plan to see this. In month 2, this, 3, this. You can get into detail in that consulting agreement. Also, management consultants are oftentimes not paid a salary. They're oftentimes paid based on the deliverables. So we'll pay hourly, or we will pay based on when they give us, this report, for example. So you really do want to present the application in a way that when the government looks at it, they say, yeah, that actually looks a lot like a management consulting agreement, rather than as someone coming to the US to fill a permanent role. So let's switch and talk about economists. This is the other particularly challenging category, but for a completely different reason. The reason is that the government in November of 2017 issued a policy statement saying that economists need to actually be doing what economists are said to do in the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So let's take a look at that real quick. I'm going to pull it up right now. So economists. OOH, economist. And if you're at your computer, I recommend you pull it up as well, what they do. Economists research economic issues related to education, the labor force, international trade, and other topics. They conduct surveys, collect data, analyze data using mathematical models, statistical tools, etc. They interpret and forecast trends. They advise businesses, governments, and individuals on problems related to fiscal policy or other economic topics, and they present their research. Okay, so what is the government saying that economists do not do? Well, they specifically say that economists cannot primarily perform the job duties of financial analysts, market research analysts, and marketing specialists. Okay, so what does that mean? Financial analysts are roles that primarily, I'm going to use language here, I'm going to read this language. Roles that primarily conduct quantitative analyses of information affecting investment programs. Okay, so the job is to increase profits. You're looking at ways to increase profits from investments, okay? Opportunities to commit money for the purpose of generating profits. Market research analysts and marketing specialists, they gather and analyze data to help companies market their products and services. Okay, they might research competitors' pricing, marketing methods, and advise on new markets and opportunities. So if the role that you're coming to the US to fill, if most of the job duties are those of market research analysts, marketing specialists, or financial analysts, you're going to face some issues when you, excuse me, apply for the TN visa. So be very aware of that. Let me say, first of all, if a minority of your role is doing those things, it might not be a problem. The problem is when most of your time is spent doing those things. So if 10% of your time is spent doing the role of a market research analyst or a financial analyst, it may very well not be a problem. If it is a majority of your time, it is very likely to be a problem. But I would recommend, this is a case where a conversation with the employer would be helpful to make sure that your job duties really do align with what the Occupational Outlook Handbook says an economist does. And let me quickly say as well, when I say a conversation with the employer, a lot of what we do regarding TN visas is have those conversations with employers. So obviously you could have that conversation with the employer. If we can be helpful in that process, we are very happy to do that. It really depends on the client and their preferences. So we can work with you as the employee, or if you'd like us to directly interface with the employer, of course, we're very happy to do that as well. So again, that regarding the economist category, that category is challenging because of that November 2017 policy memo that really narrowed the scope of what an economist can do. Let's talk a little bit about the TN application process explained, and get into a few more details. I gave an overview of this process. Again, Canadians can apply at a port of entry, nationals of Mexico cannot. So what would Canadians bring to the port of entry? They would provide their job offer letter. Again, that job offer letter is going to have an original signature from the employer. It should be on the employer's letterhead. The reason for this is border officials do encounter a lot of fraud. So they are going to want to see that this is an authentic document. Original signature copies are not okay. Similarly, you'll bring supporting documentation showing your proof of citizenship. That's typically going to be your passport, as well as proof of your qualifications. And again, you would figure out based on the regulations, what do you need to show you qualify? So if you're qualifying based on your degree, you would bring your original diploma, not a copy. I know it sounds crazy, but you bring your actual diploma to the border and show I have a degree in economics. Therefore, I qualify for the economist category. A quick side note on that, it is possible to be approved based on a related degree. So let's take an example. If you're applying as an accountant and your degree is not in accounting, but is in, say, economics or in finance, that's a related degree. That is probably going to be okay. But what you would want to do is bring your transcript as well. Bring an original transcript or a certified copy and actually go through the transcript and highlight the courses that are related to accounting. If your degree is more and more unrelated to the job. So let's say you're applying as an accountant, but your degree is in English. You're going to have a hard time qualifying based on the degree. So your degree really should be related to the job you're coming to the US to do. And if it's not related, really emphasize the transcript and that you actually have done the work to qualify you to do the job. But again, if the degree is unrelated, you face an uphill battle and might be looking at a denial. So you would bring proof of citizenship, your passport, you'd bring that employer letter, you'd bring proof of your qualifications. Now, some ports of entry are optimized for faster TN processing. So first time, you can find these on the Customs and Border Protection website. So first-time applicants might want to apply at one of those ports of entry. We also do recommend that you call ahead of time just to make sure they're open at the time you plan to arrive, and if there are any unique requirements, like some have a particular entry that they want you to use or a particular process that they want you to follow. So just call ahead of time. It never hurts. For nationals of Mexico, again, you would need to apply for the visa at a consulate. You really would bring with you exactly what a national of Canada would bring to the port of entry. So you'd bring your passport, you'd bring proof of your qualifications, original documents. You would bring the original employer letter, proof that you actually have a job offer that lays out the terms of the employment. An additional note, I should have said this before, if you're applying based on experience, again, management consultants do allow that, and there are other categories that may allow an experience component. Then you would want to bring experience letters. So these are letters from past employers with original signatures, and ideally on their letterhead, that explains how long you worked for them, what your job duties were, what your job title was, and explaining that you do meet that experience requirement. So nationals of Mexico would bring all that documentation to the consulate. Step one of applying would be to submit the online form, the DS-160. They'd pay the application fee, they'd do their biometrics, fingerprints, and photos, and they'd have their appointment at the consulate, where they'd have an interview with the consular officer. And again, those applying for a renewal may be eligible to apply by mail, but the consulate will let you know that. And finally, those who are within the US, whether you're a national of Canada or Mexico, can apply through USCIS. And the process there is that the employer would file the form I-129, and that would be sent to USCIS with copies, excuse me, of the supporting documents. So you would not send the originals to USCIS. And briefly, some tips and common pitfalls. I've already mentioned a few of these. I always recommend to call ahead at the port of entry, especially if you're unfamiliar. It never hurts. Sometimes they do change their procedures, so just be aware that if you're making a long trip, especially, you know when they'll accept your application and if there are any unique procedures to have in mind. Make sure that the person at the employer who signed your employer letter is available to answer calls when you plan to approach either the border, the airport, or to have your consular interview. Because there are times when the government official will pick up the phone and actually call them. And the goal typically is just to make sure the job is legitimate, that there actually is a job at the end of the line. Again, government officials see a lot of fraud, so they do sometimes do whatever they can to try to sniff out anything that might sound or look suspicious. So just have the person who signed the letter have their phone nearby at the time you plan to approach the government and apply for the visa. Again, bring original documents. So if you're qualifying based on your education, bring your original diploma. If you bring transcripts, bring official certified copies of those transcripts, and you want an original signed version of the employer letter. And finally, the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa. So what that means is that it is not a green card. You do need to show that at the end of your TN status, you intend to leave the US. You don't intend to remain in the US permanently. Now, that question usually does not come up if you're, in your first period, your first TN, or even your second TN. However, once you reach that 10-year mark that Ian hit, or maybe even a little bit shorter, you might start getting questions about, tell me about your ties to Mexico or Canada. Do you actually intend to leave? So do be prepared for that. And you might want to bring documents showing your ties to your home country, just to be just to be safe in case the question comes up. With that, we can go ahead and transfer over to questions.
Great. No, thank you very much, Dustin. That was very informative. A lot of great information there. And there were a number of questions. Some of them we will, I think Dustin maybe answered later in the presentation, so we'll go through them very, very quickly. But so let's go through them. First one, thank you for sharing. When applying for jobs in US from Canada, should one select yes or no for required sponsorship now or in the future? That's an excellent question, great question that we get often. I recommend that you say no. It may depend on how the question is worded. If they specifically ask about TN, then I would definitely answer yes. But if not, then because of the reasons that we went through in the presentation, why we don't consider this sponsorship, that I would answer the question no. A lot of the time, if you answer the question yes, you automatically are going to be discounted. And there is a basis for answering no, given what we described earlier. As a Canadian, what are some of the common reasons TN visa application for computer systems analyst gets denied? Well, the typical reason for that particular one is that they think that you're a programmer. So TN is not available for a programmer. It is available for a computer systems analyst and a software engineer. So that's the typical reason. The other reason could be that you don't have the degree, because that's going to always be very important, that the degree matches the actual role. So you would be, and I believe computer systems analyst also allows you to qualify with diploma plus 3 years experience. But the key reason would be that they think that the job is a programming role. Under which category falls cybersecurity consultant, professional expert? It could fall under computer systems analyst or software engineer. You can't really just like say it like it's not really, it doesn't really work the kind of a title or a general description. It's going to be the job description, the actual job description. The title is not going to really matter so much. It's going to be what is the job description, and then does it fall under the job description like Dustin talked about in the Department of Labor's manual with respect to what they believe that particular person does. I'm a nurse supervisor. Do I need visa screening? I believe you mean the health screening. So I believe the answer to that is yes. Can a computer technician apply as a scientific technician? Yeah, if they qualify. So the requirements for a scientific technician are outlined in the regulations. I don't recall them off the top of my head, but I believe that the scientific technician applies to when you have a strong technical background in a particular field like engineering, et cetera, and then you are utilizing that. But the regulations, one thing about like what qualifies from what doesn't, the regulations are very clear, like much clearer than most law with respect to what does actually qualify. Just a plain reading of what the regulations are. So we do, advise you the link that Dustin sent, which shows kind of, how it is someone qualifies under a particular category. That definitely encourage you to take a look at that. Is U.S. bachelor's, master's degree required or helpful for getting jobs in IT? Well, if it's required for the TN category, so software engineering, it's definitely required. You need a bachelor's degree. For computer systems analysts, it's either bachelor's degree or diploma. So it's a 2-year diploma course plus 3 years experience. So that's what the requirement. And again, that's outlined in the actual regulations. So in that list that Dustin, the link that Dustin mentioned, where you can see exactly what's required for each particular category. For all IT petitions such as data engineer, developer, project manager, architect, should one select systems analyst? I don't know. It depends. Again, depends what the job actually is. So that would dictate what it is, which category you actually fall under. Like if you're an engineer, then you're going to likely be under the engineering category. So it really would depend. You would need to see the job description. A TN holder can have different employer than the visa says. No, you have to work for the employer that has given you the job. You can't just work for any employer if that's what the question is getting at. What happens if someone in TN visa is let go? Does the government? No. So if you let go, you have a 60-day grace period. The company's under no obligation. As Justin mentioned, it's at will employment. It's not like other visas where they have to return you to your home country and things like that. You just would have a 60-day grace period as long as you had a valid I-94, and you would have to either find some other type of visa or leave. What happens if someone? Oh, sorry. At the end of your present, yeah. So just send us an email and we can send you detail on fees. Is there a process to apply for a green card for a TN? So what I would advise you to do is go to. We have another webinar on moving from non-immigrant visa categories to green card categories. And I would advise you to attend one of those webinars or go to our YouTube channel to look at one of those videos, because it is quite a complicated and long answer, much longer than we have time for today. Though there's a whole webinar on this, on this particular topic. Is it good to have a sponsor and kids application done at the same time as at the border? So this question may have come in earlier because I think it's because I think Dustin did go through this, how, what the application process is and how it is that you get a TN. And if the children are Canadian, they can come to the border with the parents. What if the original degree is at school in the locker? There's another question after that about not having the original degree. As Dustin mentioned, you should have your original degree. If you don't have your original degree, then you are running the risk of the visa not being approved at the border. But my degree is already assessed. So again, your degree is required, and if your degree has to be assessed, you need to bring that also, because if your degree is not from Canada, US, or Mexico, then you will require an assessment. You would have to bring that also. I'm pursuing a master's degree at University of from Canada. However, the course is not yet complete. No, so we have to have a degree to apply for a TN visa. So the course has to be complete. Have you seen applicants with just certifications? If the category allows that, like, so for example, computer systems analyst allows a diploma or certificate that's 2 years in duration, that can qualify. The next question is, how do you move from a TN to a green card? Again, go refer to the webinar. How do you move to a green card? Again, same question. What other TN categories do not require a degree? So again, please refer to the list to see which ones may allow for work experience in conjunction with something else. I called the border security officer, informed me the Canadian permanent resident spouse is able to get a TD visa at the border. I don't believe that's possible. So, you get the person's name, but I believe that they would have to be a Canadian citizen. Only Canadians are visa exempt, not just someone who's a permanent resident of Canada. A relationship manager in commercial banking industry. Can I qualify for a TN if I have a master's degree? If you qualify, it depends on whether or not you qualify under one of the categories. It could be accountant, it could be probably not economist, but you definitely, you set up a consultation to see if you do. Does a nurse practitioner qualify for a TN? I know a nurse does, so I'm not really sure what you mean by a nurse practitioner, but if again, go to the list that Dustin went through at the beginning of the presentation, and they will list out exactly which degrees are required for each different profession. And if you have that degree, then you could be eligible. How should we budget taking into account legal fees? As I said, send us an email and we can send you our legal fees. I'm a Canadian citizen. I have an offer letter from a U.S. employer as a nurse supervisor. I studied in the Philippines. Do I need visa screening? Probably. If you're talking about the healthcare workers require additional screening. So I think that's what the question is getting at. And then you would have to otherwise meet all of the TN visa requirements, degree, etc. If you want a new TN visa with a new employer, do you need to show proof of previous employer? No, well, not if it's not relevant. So if you are going with a new employer, then you would need to satisfy the TN requirements for that particular employer. As an engineer, can I apply for a scientific technician position? I'm not sure if that's just a repeat of the same question, so I'll just skip it. How much time from start to finish on average should we expect the process to last in Mexico? So we can process a TN petition pretty quickly in a couple of weeks, and the timing for Mexico would depend on how fast you were able to get an appointment, because you would actually have to go to a consulate to get an appointment. Great, so that is fantastic. Very, very active. A lot of questions here, and definitely thank you very much for joining us. And as I said, we will send you a copy of this webinar. We'll also send you a TN visa guide. I'm not sure if I mentioned that at the beginning, but we'll send you a TN visa guide, and we will send you a link with it. You can set up a consultation if you have additional questions. And thank you again, Dustin, for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.